time for Dirt Daily, and today's Dirt Daily we are going to work on a Jeep YJ. But first, this episode is brought to you by onX Off-Road. onX Off-Road is a mapping app. You put it on your phone and it helps you find off-road trails wherever you are. And onX Off-Road reached out to me because they have a new project. Let me tell you exactly what it says. onX Off-Road is building a school bus called the onX Cool Bus. And if you're a member, if you're not a member, sign up today. If you're an elite member, you can get your name on the side of the bus. Premium member also gets their name on the side of the bus, but in a smaller size. And basic members, you don't even have to pay for it, can get your name small. So, there's that. I don't know about school buses, but I can tell you that the onX app is really useful. I use it all the time when I'm looking at off-road trails. Plus, if you sign up for the Elite membership, you get discounts with companies. And the thing that I like about the Elite membership is that you can find out landowners. So if you find an area that you want to go exploring or go four-wheeling, or maybe you find a vehicle on some property and you're trying to figure out who owns it, I use that setting on the Elite membership all the time on the map. So check it out on onX Off-Road. Today's project, like I said, we are going to work on a Jeep YJ, or in my case, a Jeep YJ that is disguised as a Willys Wagon. And today's project is, what do you do if your Jeep YJ doesn't start? This Jeep has been sitting for a while. This is a project that we built a couple years ago on the Dirt Everyday TV show, and then it's been parked. I've taken it on a couple adventures, but it's been sitting for a long time, and it doesn't want to start. So today we're gonna go through the steps of what I have found, why I think it's not running. I've already done a little bit of diagnosis, but I'm going to backtrack and go through all the steps with you, and then hopefully we can fix it and make this thing run and drive. Because A, when a vehicle sits, it has problems, and that's probably the worst thing for a vehicle is actually not driving it. Unless you drain all the fluids and lift it up on jack stands and protect it. I think one of the worst things you can do to a vehicle is to just let it sit. And this one, unfortunately, has been sitting for a while. I found a mouse was living inside, so I've already cleaned that out, which I think is gross whenever I find rodents in vehicles. But I got it all cleaned out, and now we're gonna go through the steps to make it run. Or first of all, why won't it run? And then hopefully, how do we make it run? All right, let's get to work. Even though this Jeep looks like a 1961 Willys Wagon, it has all of the powertrain of a 1994 Jeep Wrangler, also known as the YJ. The YJ is the square headlight Wrangler, which was actually the first era of Wranglers. Before that were CJs, CJ5, CJ2, CJ3, CJ3B, CJ7s, even CJ8s. There was a CJ10, which ironically also had its square headlights, but that's kind of getting off on a tangent. This is based on a YJ. So it has a YJ 4-liter inline-6 engine, fuel injected. It has an AX15 5-speed manual transmission. It has a 241 transfer case that has had slip yoke eliminators added to it. This one in particular has a set of Old Man Emu or ARB suspension leaf springs that gives it a very slight lift, and then a custom set of Dana 44 axles built by Curry with air lockers front and rear, so that it really has the look of the classic Willys Wagon, but it should run and drive like a normal vehicle. Now, the inside of this vehicle is kind of rough. It's pretty close to stock 61 Willys Wagon, but the dash is kind of a big mess, and I never really finished out the interior the way I wanted to. But the vehicle runs and drives, or it did run and drive. In fact, it pretty much drove just like a 94 Jeep YJ, which some would claim is one of the best Wranglers ever built because it had a beefy frame, it had the tried and true 4-liter engine, basic simple leaf spring suspension. The AX15 is a great transmission. Overall, they were pretty good vehicles. And some people think that the YJ helped save the Jeep brand and keep it from going away completely. But getting off on a tangent, today's project is how do we make this thing run? So this vehicle's been sitting a while. I obviously got it in here, but I wasn't able to drive it in here because it doesn't run. I just brought it in here so that I could show you what I would go through the steps of. Now, number one, a vehicle needs a battery, and this has an Optima yellow top on it. It's been sitting for a while. I've had good and bad luck with Optimas. I find that if the vehicle doesn't have anything that can like sap the battery, like a clock or a radio or a computer, like if none of that stuff is constantly on, the Optimas seem to last forever. If it has anything that takes a little tiny trickle off of the battery, the Optimas seem to run down really low, and then they have a really hard time coming back to life or getting back into working order. And they're kind of hard to jumpstart as well. But the wagon doesn't really have anything that's taking a charge from the battery constantly, like when it's shut off. So there's no clock, there's no radio, there's none of that stuff. So I've had pretty good luck with this in particular Optima. But I did put it on a trickle charger, and what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna grab my power probe. I use this thing all the time for all my electrical stuff. And one of the cool things is you can push this button and it'll tell you the voltage that the battery has. I'm not sure if that'll focus, but when I push that button, it tells me 12.2 volts, which that should be plenty to start this vehicle. If you don't know how this works, when you push the top button, it shows you the voltage, plus it puts 12 volts up to here, or whatever voltage the battery has. If you push down, it sends a ground signal to that, which is really good for testing electrical stuff. There's also a little ground pigtail right here. So you can hook this to a light, one side of the light, give it 12 volts on the other side, and see if the light works. Power probe. These things are awesome. I use them all the time. I carry one in my trail kit, and I also have one in the shop, but I could probably use a dozen more because they're so handy. So we know the battery is good. So let's hop in and see what happens when we crank the ignition. That's the hole that the rodent was in. Actually, the whole toolbox underneath here was full of mouse nest, but I got that all cleaned out. So I'm in the Willys wagon. The dash is kind of a mess. There's like wiring looms stuck underneath the dash. There's a CB radio here. There's like one oil pressure gauge and a bunch of other random stuff. Here's an old flashlight. I wonder if this works. Oh yeah, that might help you see a little bit better. There's the wiring that's all a mess inside underneath the dash. So the first thing I noticed when I turned the key was I was not getting a fuel pump running. I can hear something clicking, like I'm getting probably a relay for a fuel pump, but usually I could hear the fuel pump buzzing. And if I push in the clutch, so we're getting a crank, which is a good signal. The thing seems to crank fine. Seems like the battery's got a good charge. The starter is cranking over no problem, but I don't hear fuel pump. And usually that's a sound that you would hear as soon as you crank over the ignition. There were just by going to the run position, you'll hear a short bzzz, and it'll build up pressure and then stop. And this doesn't do that at all. So my first theory is fuel pump. So let's go look into the fuel pump under the hood. I said let's look under the hood at the fuel pump, which is kind of not really what I meant to say. The fuel pump is not under the hood on this vehicle. The fuel pump is an electric fuel pump that's actually in the fuel tank in the back of the Jeep. But what you can do is you can look at the fuel rail, and there's usually a little Schrader valve on the fuel rail. And a Schrader valve is like the little valve on your tire stem. And if you press in that Schrader valve and fuel sprays everywhere, that tells you that you are building fuel pressure from your fuel pump. This Jeep also happens to have a fuel pressure gauge that I installed in line with the fuel system. So I can look at that and see if there's any pressure there, but it's currently not reading anything. So I am going to remove this air cleaner, which is just kind of a cheapo aftermarket guy that's mounted here, and get to that Schrader valve, and we'll see if any fuel comes out. Okay. So here is the Schrader valve. And if you take this off and you look down in there, there is a little kind of pin, and if you push that pin down, fuel should come out. And it should pretty much spray everywhere. Watch your eyes. And when I push it down with this screwdriver, no fuel is coming out at all. So that tells me we have a fuel issue. We're not getting fuel to the fuel rail, we're not getting any fuel pressure, and because this is an electric fuel pump, which is in the fuel tank, before we dive into replacing the fuel pump, let's see if maybe there's an issue with the electrical. Like is the fuel pump relay, which is in the fuse box right here underneath the hood, something that just needs replaced, and maybe that will fix our problem. Over here on the passenger side is the fuse box. And inside this fuse panel, there are relays that run various components, and then there are also fuses, and then there's some little baby fuses. So these relays are your horn, your fuel pump. This one would be ABS pump, which we don't have. This would be air conditioning, which we have an air conditioning compressor, but never actually hooked up the whole air conditioning system. So we'll keep that. Auto shutdown and starter. So we know that the starter is working, and we know that the fuel pump, it doesn't seem to be working. So the other thing to check is there's a row of fuses here, and this last fuse is for the fuel system and ECU. So I'm going to start by pulling that out and looking at it and seeing if it's blown. Come on, you. Be gentle. Come on out. Hold that up to the light, and everything looks fine on that fuse. So that tells me that we don't have a blown fuse. Now we might have a dead fuel pump relay. So I'm going to pull out this fuel pump relay, and I'm going to swap, well, I would say swap the horn, but we don't know if the horn one is bad also. We know that the starter one is good because the starter is cranking over. So I'm going to put the starter relay in where the fuel pump is. I'm going to put the fuel pump relay in where the starter was. And then I'm going to hop in and see if the fuel pump kicks on and if it starts. If the fuel pump kicks on but the starter doesn't turn, that tells me that the relay is bad. If the fuel pump doesn't run but the starter still cranks, that tells me both relays are good, but we have a fuel pump issue back at the pump. Let's crank it up. Good news, the relays are good. Bad news, I think we have a fuel pump issue. The starter is working. I can actually hear that relay click when I turn the key to the run position. So that tells me that the fuel pump relay is fine, but it's a problem back at the fuel pump. So now we get to go underneath the vehicle. I think we will leave the air cleaner off so we can test the fuel rail later after we get the fuel pump in or figured out, and we can put all this back together. I do know that I want to raise the vehicle up and probably test the wires right at the fuel pump. So I'm going to hook my power probe up to the battery, and then we'll raise this all up in the air and go figure out what's going on with our fuel pump in the back. Hook this guy up. Under the Jeep, I've found the fuel system has an inline fuel filter. This is an Earl's plumbing fuel filter. And this is the type of fuel filter that you can disassemble, and there's a filter element inside there. So I don't think I have a spare filter element with me. I might need to order one of those, but if I come to the back, I can see the fuel tank, and it's a plastic fuel tank. So if this was a steel fuel tank, there's a pretty good possibility there could be rust in it, and rust is clogging up the fuel filter. That's pretty common on old 4x4s. However, with these plastic newer tanks, rust in the fuel system and in that fuel filter being clogged is less of a concern. Probably still be a good idea to change out that fuel filter, but I'm less concerned that the problem is the fuel filter and more that the problem is the fuel pump. In the front of the fuel tank, there are 2 hoses and a wiring loom that are coming from the top of the fuel tank. Now, the very first problem I have found is right up here. As you can see, the fuel hoses coming from the top of the fuel tank going up to the engine are pinched between the top of the fuel tank and this rib on the bottom of the body. I know that this fuel tank was installed on the chassis when we set the body on it, and this tells me that I made a mistake and got the hoses pinched. Those should have gone right over here in this little bit of a gap, or way over here on the driver's side where there's another little bit of a gap. For some reason, the hoses were made the perfect length that they got wedged right in the middle and got pinched. That is not good for the fuel pump, because it means the fuel pump is pushing through this pinched section of hose. The Jeep actually did run and drive just fine, so it wasn't a terrible problem, but it definitely wasn't ideal. Next, right up in this corner, you can see the wiring loom, and the cool thing is that right up here on top is a plug for the fuel pump and the fuel sending unit for the fuel level, and then a ground. So what I'm gonna do is, I know that this orange wire goes to the fuel pump and the black wire is the ground. So I am going to put power to the orange wire, put ground to the black wire, and see if we can make that fuel pump run. Okay, I put 2 little pieces of welding wire in the end of this plug. I'm gonna grab my power probe. The power probe has a ground terminal on it, so when I touch that, I get the ground noise. So I'm going to hook that up to this side of the plug, and then I'm going to come here, and that's a good sound. That tells me that I'm getting a full connection all the way through all the wires. So now when I apply 12 volts to this side, we should be able to hear the fuel pump run if the fuel pump is good. We're getting no noise from the fuel pump, which is kind of what we have been expecting the whole time, is that the fuel pump is bad. The fuel pump on this Jeep is in the fuel tank. But let's talk about fuel pumps. There's actually a couple different styles of fuel pumps. For this gas engine, this one is fuel injected. It has an electric fuel pump, and it is mounted inside the fuel tank. In the early days, the fuel pump was mounted right on the side of the engine. As the engine would turn, it would pump an arm, and that would pump fuel from the fuel tank up to the carburetor. We saw that when I was working on my Willys flat fender last. There's also a style of fuel pump that mounts to the frame rail, and you might think that is the best style because it's easy to access, it's easy to diagnose, you can run jumper wires right to it and see if it's running. The thing about that is when the fuel pump is not in the tank, it tends to run hotter. The fuel itself is actually cooling the fuel pump, which makes the fuel pumps last longer. That being said, I feel like I've been on a string of fuel pump swaps these days. I had to put one in a big white Ford, I had to put one in my Land Cruiser, and now I'm putting one in the Willys Wagon. All of these vehicles are from the 90s, and I don't know if it's just the fuel has deteriorated the pumps themselves just only last so long, or the quality of the pumps is going out. But once again, we're gonna drop a fuel tank and swap in a fuel pump. I'm probably gonna swap the entire sending unit so that I know I have a brand new sending unit and I have a brand new fuel pump, brand new ground wires, everything will be brand new, plug it right into the top of the tank. Plus, I'll probably extend some of the fuel lines so that the fuel line is not getting pinched between the tank and the body tub the way it is. If I get a little bit more slack to it and I can route it a little bit better, we should be safe and not have that issue anymore. So, roll the transmission jack underneath the Willys Wagon and drop the fuel tank. We're going to start by disconnecting these fuel filler hoses so that the fuel tank can drop away from the tub. Then this skid plate, which supports the fuel tank, bolts to the back of the tub in 3 different spots, so those will all have to be removed. I don't know if this little spotlight on the back will have to come off or not. It might be able to just swing out of the way. Then across the front, there's 4 more bolts that mount the skid plate and hold the fuel tank up to this cross member that we added to the chassis. So we can unbolt those, put the transmission jack under this, and drop the whole thing down. I'll also have to watch these hoses as it drops down, and I may need to disconnect them before it gets very far away from the body. I think all my hardware is disconnected. I had the filler hoses, the hose clamps disconnected, so those should pull apart as it starts coming down. I'm gonna start lowering the tank down. I have this little backup off-roady light mounted here, and it kind of looks like it might be in the way, but I think I can work it around that. So let's tap the transmission jack and see if stuff starts coming apart. I'm gonna give those fuel filler necks a little spray with some WD. Keep an eye on the front side with all the hoses and wires. Seem to have enough slack there. I think it can keep coming down. These need to pull apart. I can get this filler neck. I need to move this jack stand to the other side. I like having a jack of some sort underneath. There it goes. There it goes. Oh boy. Look at those hoses. Look how pinched they got. Right there. Oh my goodness. Kind of surprised that it was even flowing fuel at all. I'm going to replace the entire fuel sending unit that bolts into the top of the tank. So I need to disconnect both of these hoses. Now, one of them is the return, one of them is the pressure. I'm not sure which one is which. So, and it doesn't really matter, just as long as I reconnect them the way that I've disconnected them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this paint pen, I'm going to mark this hose, and then I'm going to take my telephone, I'm going to come up here, I'm going to take a picture of this. Now, when I disconnect these, they can go hang wherever, but I know that that one with the white dots is the one that's closer to the plug, and I will make sure that both of these lines match on the new sending unit, and then I can reconnect them the same way. That being said, I may still need to replace these hoses so that they have a little bit more slack and they don't get pinched between the tank and this cross member that runs up here. Pretty much guaranteed to get fuel on you when dropping the fuel tank. I've never had it happen that it came out of a vehicle without getting messy. The Land Cruiser actually was pretty good because I didn't have to drop the tank. I was able to open up, remove the back seat, and there was a panel underneath the back seat, and I could access the fuel pump. I could probably do that on this vehicle, like cut a hole in the floor in the back here so that this was accessible. I don't really know that it's worth it because I really don't plan on doing this again. I mean, I guess it's worth it. Somebody might have to change these at some point. All right, I got both hoses off. I have the one that's marked that goes to this side, which is closer to the fuel wiring, but I took that photo so that I knew that I'd put it back together right. The other one, I actually had to cut a little bit of the hose because it was stuck on the hose barb or the metal barb from the sending unit. So I probably need to replace at least that one, if not both of them. Actually, I should probably replace both of them because they're pretty squashed up here where they were pinched between the tub and the tank. So, and I want to have a little bit more hose so I can route it safer, maybe through this little divot in the fuel tank so that there's more space for it and it's safer. So, I know one of these only has to run up to the fuel filter. The other one is the return line that runs all the way up to the fuel rail on the engine. So I probably need to figure out which one's which and get some fresh fuel hose coming. And this whole sending unit is going to come out so we can replace all of that. And of course I got fuel on me because that's what always happens whenever you drop a fuel tank. Did you know, I don't know if we ever mentioned this when we built the Willys Wagon, but all the drivetrain on the Willys Wagon, except for like the Curry axles, all the engine, tranny, and fuel tank and all that stuff, that all came from Dulcich. Dulcich had this wrecked Jeep YJ over at his farm, and we were able to rescue that and disassemble it and build the Willys Wagon with all those parts. So it's turned into a really cool little rig. And however, I don't know that this fuel sending unit and fuel pump was ever replaced. I don't know that he ever replaced it, and I don't know that we did it when we built this thing. It's probably the original one, so it's about time to replace this. Plus the fuel stinks. Why does old gas stink so bad? So next step is I'm going to pull the sending unit. I'm going to dump all the old fuel out of this thing, let this thing air out, see if there's any junk down in there, track down some fresh fuel line, and then we'll start putting it all back together. I ordered a new fuel sending unit. This is straight from Rock Auto. I don't know if you've ever used Rock Auto. They're really good for stuff like this. You can go on there. If you're not in a rush and you have the time to order something online, they usually have really good deals. They usually have pretty good parts. Like this is a Delphi, which I think is probably a pretty good brand for a fuel sending unit and a fuel pump. And it looks like it has an identical plug. Everything looks the same, even the orientation and the height of everything looks to be just about identical to what is on there. So I am going to install this. I have to remove this little baggie. There's the filter that goes into the fuel pump. This is the return line that comes down here. And so the return line is the line that is closest to the plug. And then the pressure line coming up through the fuel pump after it pulls in through this filter is the one that would have been going, is the one I had to cut off. So I'm probably going to need to replace some of those fuel hoses in there, but this looks like it'll bolt right in. So now my next step is to remove the sending unit from the fuel tank. I did blast all this with the air compressor, the air line, to try and get all the dirt and grit away from it. I know I mentioned when you have a plastic fuel tank that you don't have to worry so much about rust getting into the fuel line, but you still do have to worry about dirt, grit, sand, whatever could be coming in through the fuel. And now we are going to pull this out and see what type of garbage. Oh, And funny, I say you don't have to worry about rust, but you might actually have rust right on the fuel sending unit itself. This is old, stinky gas. Ugh, that looks terrible. And then also, there's always like a rubber line between the fuel pump and the hose, and that rubber is a very specific type of rubber that can be submerged in fuel for a long time. And you can, I don't know if you can see it on there, but this line is starting to crack. So that could be another reason why this is all failing. So overall, lots of garbage, and probably need to dump out all that old fuel and clean out this tank, maybe get in there and blow it out or vacuum it out after it's drained out and dried out. But you will be reusing this gasket on the top if you didn't order a new one. And there's also this plate, just kind of like the bolt plate that bolts down on it. And then this rubber gasket on the bottom of it. So we want to be gentle removing that. Or we might need to go buy one because this one's starting to fall apart. Wonder if we can get that local or if I have to order that online and wait for that to show up. Really should have thought about that when I ordered this. It might be savable, salvageable, but we probably want to replace that. This, on the other hand, is all garbage and it can all go away. You could rebuild this. You could put a new fuel pump here, new hose there, clean all this filter, or replace that filter. But it seems like for the price of it, buying the complete sending unit is cheaper and quicker. Oh, that's kind of neat. There's like a little reservoir that the fuel pump sits down in so that the fuel seems to be kind of secure around the pump. All right, let's go get rid of this old gas. Let this tank dry out. I got the gasket. The old gasket was getting torn when I was removing it, so I was able to track one down, order it online. So it set me back a couple days, but the gasket is here and ready to go in place. So now it's time to put in the fuel sending unit. This has the float for the fuel gauge. It also has a filter here that picks up into this new pump. This is the return side. This will go into that little reservoir in the bottom of the tank. I've cleaned the tank. I vacuumed out all the grit, anything that was in there, hosed it out, let it dry, which was good. It gave me time to do that while I was waiting for that gasket. This is the return line. This is the pressure or feed line. And then here is the plug ready to plug in. So we are going to feed this into the tank. Kind of want to be gentle in this step. Don't want to smash anything down in there. Get that sending unit in. Make sure everything is lined up. Hook down in here so that it all is seated right where you want it. And then there's actually a heavy metal plate that the screws all screw against, so that you're not actually screwing down onto, you're kind of sandwiching that top plate of the sending unit and then the gasket. We'll get two of these lined up on opposite corners. I think we might have this spun around. Front, top, front, top. I don't know if you can see, but right now all of the holes are lined up, and this says front, top. And when I remove this, this down here says front, top. So even though they're labeled, they're mislabeled. One of them's mislabeled, one of them's in the wrong spot. But now I know that in order to have all of these lined up, that has to be the opposite of the other one. Things are starting to make sense. This would be front top. Front top on a YJ would be, that would be the front, because the fuel filler would be on the driver's side. So it would actually be spun around and going in the tank like this, or in the Jeep like this. But because I have the tank spun around and the fuel filler coming in from the passenger side like it is on the Willys Wagon, this is backwards. I don't know why the gasket is marked backwards, but it doesn't really matter. As long as all of the fasteners go in. I had the sending unit back in. Everything's ready to go back in the Jeep. I do have 2 hoses coming here, which is actually 1 hose. I ran it all the way up to the fuel rail, brought it all the way back, and then I ran it back up to that fuel filter. We've swapped out that fuel filter. So everything is ready to go back together. I haven't cut these because I wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure I had enough length. And I have a little bit extra here, which is good. That'll be good for use down the road. However, how long do you cut these? How much slack do you give this? Well, my theory is I'm going to set the transmission jack so that it looks like the fuel tank would be at ground level if you were out in the desert, say, and you dropped the tank and you had to disconnect this. Let's say you're four-wheeling, fuel pump goes out, you figure out it's a fuel pump through all those steps we did before, and you don't have a lift, but you are able to get the fuel pump at a local auto parts store. So what you do is you drop the tank, you and your buddy unbolt all this thing and set it on the ground because it's full of fuel, so it's kind of heavy. But you want to make sure you have enough fuel hose slack so that when it goes to ground level, you can disconnect it and not have to be like, have one guy holding it while the other guy's disconnecting a couple hose clamps. So even though we will have extra hose on here, that's how I'm gonna route it. Plus, I wanna route it over here and zip tie it to this strap so that when it's all hooked up, it's going through that little divot in the fuel tank that we found before and not getting pinched between that rib in the body and the top of the tank right here. So I'm gonna basically say something like that should be enough. I'm gonna cut this hose. Also, I'm going to then double check that the return line is the line going all the way to the fuel rail, and the feed line is the one going to that fuel pump, or fuel filter, which then goes up to the fuel rail. Tank is all together. It's time to put it back up in the bottom of the Willys Wagon. I zip tied the hoses up to this strap so that they sit right where there's enough clearance. And then they run up into the chassis. Time to raise the tank up. We'll have to hook these filler hoses up as it all goes back together. All right, let's put this thing back in this Jeep. All the hoses are clearing. Just kind of have to work everything back up into its spot. When I first got this Willys Wagon, I bought it out of a garage that was behind Freiberger's house. You guys all know Freiberger. And the guy that had it for years. It had a 351 Ford engine in it, and it blew up, and he just parked it. And I bought it, and the first thing we did an episode where we put a Chevy LS 4.8 liter engine in it. And that was cool. But then I saw this Willys Wagon that was built by the guys at Jeep, and like corporate Jeep, they'd built one as like this concept retro vehicle. And it was really cool because they had put it on like a TJ or an LJ frame. And I was like, that's perfect. It doesn't need an LS engine. It's just like for tooling around in. And then I found this wrecked YJ, and we basically we married it to the YJ. So it's the 4-liter, has all this like basic YJ stuff. And a lot of people will be like, you took an LS engine out to put a 4-liter in? But yes, I did that, which is, a lot of people would say is dumb. Might have been dumb. But I think it's pretty cool because this Jeep now just drives like a YJ. It's not a drag racer, but it's fun to drive. It's easy to drive. All the drivetrain is compatible. It has 44s front and rear. It doesn't have huge tires. It doesn't have super low gears. It has lockers. It's kind of like the perfect just cruising rig. And I guess that's kind of the thing is I feel like a lot of people, when they build stuff, when they build retro vehicles, they want to overpower them and put an LS and big horsepower. And depending on what you're using it for, like putting in a smaller engine is, I think it's kind of cool. I've always said you should never swap a 4-liter into something. They're great in Jeeps, but then putting them in other stuff. But considering that we kind of kept all the drivetrain together, maybe I can accept that I did it on this one. I don't know. I think it's a cool Jeep. Hopefully putting this fuel pump back in it will get it back up and running and I can get it out and use it more. It's definitely not like my favorite rig. I have other rigs, like my Wagoneer I feel like drives way nicer than this does. But this thing is definitely cool and definitely has some style. And I think getting it back up and running will make it more likely that I get it out and use it some more. I don't know. Yeah. It's coming together. Hoses are up in that little notch, wires in that little notch, wires plugged back in, hoses are zip tied up out of the way. They run up to the fuel filter and then up to the engine. We got the filler neck hoses all buttoned back up and tight. So I think it's time to put the wagon back on the ground and put some fuel in this thing. I've had a bunch of people ask me about these wheels. These were made by Amex Ada or Rugged Ridge, and they're a 16-inch steel wheel. I actually had them powder coated in this kind of vanilla color. Unfortunately, they no longer make these. They're great for that resto look, and I know that that's really popular these days to find an old Jeep and do a resto build like this. I'm really bummed that they're no longer making them, and I've had some people ask me about them and I was like, I don't know where to go otherwise. They kind of look like a trailer wheel almost. They're just a simple 16-inch narrow wheel, 5 on 5.5 bolt pattern, but I don't know the next place to go to get wheels like this. So if you hear of any place making these, let me know because I've had people ask me about them. Gasoline. Okay, cross your fingers. This whole front bench seat's falling apart. All right, let's go. Why do I not hear the fuel pump running? Oh, I hear it now. I can hear it. Do we have fuel pressure? We have fuel pressure. What do we have at the fuel rail? That's reading just about 40. What's this guy say? Oh yeah, there's gas coming out there. So it should crank over. Maybe we just need to crank it a little bit more. Okay, we have fuel pressure up at the fuel rail. Yeah, boy! The wagon's back. Woohoo! I feel pretty good about this project. This Jeep was not running. We went through a few steps to try and figure out why it wasn't running. I had a theory from the start because I wasn't hearing the fuel pump, but we went through the steps of it doesn't run, is it missing fuel? One thing that we didn't check that I look at in hindsight, which is kind of dumb that we didn't check because this is very much a possibility, was does the truck have fuel? And I remember putting gas in it at some point, but there have been plenty of times that people have dove into a major problem that they thought was there, when in reality either the battery wasn't charged enough or the fuel tank didn't have fuel in it. So don't feel dumb if you think you need a fuel pump when you just need some gas. It happens all the time to people all over the place. But if you do have a problem, whether it's with a Willys wagon that has a full YJ drivetrain or you have a square headlight Jeep YJ, go through some of these steps to try and figure out why it's not running, especially if it's been sitting a while. And electric fuel pumps, they always seem to die eventually. I don't know what the problem is with our gas these days. There are additives that you can put in fuel tanks for if you're gonna park it and let it sit for a while. I don't have one that I recommend, but I know that they're out there. Whether or not they work, that's anybody's guess. But I would probably put something in this if I know that it's gonna sit for 3 to 6 months. But hopefully it doesn't sit for that long because that's when the mice get in there and eat stuff. So I hope you guys learned something. If you have a problem, don't get flustered. Just kind of chip away at it. Is it electrical? Is it wiring? Is it plumbing? Or is it the electric component, the fuel pump, or whatever component you're working on? So keep at it, keep working on your projects. They can be frustrating, but they can also be fun. I think the moral of the story is if you don't use it, you will lose it. Whether the battery will die, the fuel pump will die, or a mouse will move in and take over your project truck. So get them out there, get them on the trail, have fun with them. That's it for this Dirt Daily. We'll see you guys next time. Let's get this Jeep out of here. We got more junk to work on.